Hello and welcome to Path to Power, our 21st edition since we started. I'm Matt Cooper.
And I'm Ivan Yates.
Slightly different format today. For the first time since we started Path to Power, we're not in studio together. I'm down in Cork doing an event, and Ivan is back in the studio at Dublin. So this is our first experiment in doing the podcast quasi-remotely. So maybe it means we won't be talking over each other as much, Ivan, as sometimes happens.
Well, it may be the first of many. We will wait and see. I'm here in Ballsbridge in the studio, ready to go.
And we have so many things to talk about. So, on our running order today, we're going to be talking about the personal safety of politicians, political intervention into GAAGO, and the future of Dublin city centre, update on the MEP race. We'll talk a little bit perhaps about Michelle O'Neill's apology in relation to attending the Bobby Story funeral during COVID. Ivan, I know, wants to talk about conveyancing, and there are other issues that will come up as well when we're a little bit chit-chat at the end. But I think we're going to have to start yet again with immigration, because it is definitely the story of the week. And I think, Ivan, there would have been a lot in the latest opinion polls that have been published, particularly the Irish Times one today. The figure that jumped out to me was that amongst potential Sinn Féin voters, 44% of them, it implied, would like to see a tougher line in immigration.
Yeah, I have no doubt that the whole European election campaign, especially more than the locals, is being submerged by the issue becoming a referendum on migration. All of the politics of the latest atrocity with 10 City. But I think the little bit of a bounce for Fine Gael might be attributable to Simon Harris's movement away from Leo Varadkar's policies. And what I'm talking about there is something we spoke about last week. The BOTPs, the beneficiaries of temporary provision, 66,000 Ukrainians, and the clear intent to reduce their money from 230 a week to €40 a week, to change their entitlements as regards accommodation for those before the 25th of March, is now becoming a reality. That plus Thornton Hall, a favourite project of yours vis-a-vis a new prison, I think signals a tougher line by Fine Gael with instant impact in the polls.
OK, but a couple of things on that, Ivan. One of the things that the Irish Times poll also revealed is that the majority of people are still favourable towards immigration, that they don't actually have a problem with all of the people who have come to live in the country, the vast majority of whom are contributing to society. They're filling jobs that need to be filled. They're actually bringing tax revenues in rather than actually being a drain on the state. And I thought that was actually encouraging, and suggested to me as well that it's quite cynical perhaps on the part of some parties and independents to be going for the lowest common denominator, acting in an anti-immigration get tough fashion as if that's what everybody wants, when actually majority of people are in favour of immigration. And I can even see at this distance from Cork that you're smirking at me, Ivan, from back in the studio in Ballsbridge. So that's one point in relation. But the second thing is, I thought it was outrageously cynical on the government's part to actually say that they're going to reduce the payments that are going to be made to Ukrainians who have been here as our guests since the Russian invasion of 2 years ago. So recently we had the introduction of the new lower rate for people arriving after the end of March. And you could certainly see the certain logic in relation to that this was a backdoor method of making sure that we didn't take more numbers in, that it would be too much for us to perhaps cope with. So maybe people could live with that. But then suddenly to say, oh, well, we need to equalise the situation and to cut the legs from under the people that were brought here as our guests, refugees fleeing a war in Russia. We already knew that there would be a review in March 2025, but to accelerate that struck me as a sneaky way of trying to deal with our immigration issue.
Well, this reinforces my view that you don't get out much, because I actually spent a lot of time this week talking to ordinary people about this and talking to people who are knocking doors of all parties and none. And what they tell me is that there are a lot of people, and I would say people between 45 and 65, who feel they're rearing their families, they're working hard, and they're not just anti-immigrant in terms of free medical card, free travel, accommodation and income, but also they feel the kind of wider anti-socialist kind of agenda that people who don't pay their way are getting their hand put under them in terms of government effort and this kind of creeping socialism. So I actually think there's a serious backlash against this and it's going to reflect in the polls. What people tell, Matt, to someone with a clipboard or someone ticking a box online to a pollster does not give you a true reflection of how people feel. People are aghast at 600 a week, mostly male people, coming down through Northern Ireland. I suppose you saw the High Court case in Belfast last Monday, which said that actually, in terms of the Rwanda law, that it doesn't apply to Northern Ireland on the post-Brexit arrangements. Talk to me about that.
Well, this is a decision in the courts, which means that now we could designate Northern Ireland as a safe third country to return people to, because the fear was that you couldn't, after a High Court judgment here in Ireland, that the UK in full was designated as unsafe and we couldn't be returning international protection applicants to the UK. Now it looks like Northern Ireland will be a safe part. This is causing all sorts of political issues as well, in the sense that it draws the border down the Irish Sea, which was something that was in all the Brexit negotiations, became an issue as well. It was also interesting to see this week that actually, despite what we'd been told in recent weeks, some people had been returned to the UK over the last couple of years when they had arrived into the country, and that Rishi Sunak's government had been taking them back until suddenly it wasn't taking them back anymore. So there's all sorts of politics been played with this, Ivan, at the moment. And we got to remember, these are people. These, we just rather facetiously last week mentioned whack-a-mole, and as we predicted, as the various encampments are closed down, they pop back up again. I was seeing this morning that the latest estimate is we're back to having 80 tents on the banks of the Grand Canal again, which I'd imagine will be removed at some stage, could even be removed by the time people get an opportunity to listen to this, and the problem will reoccur, and the government has to do something about it. But, just as I've often been saying on this podcast, that when you invite somebody into your home, you give them a bed, you don't tell them to pitch a tent out in your back garden. If we bring people here and we provide them with a safety net because they are refugees from a war, which may include medical cards and includes basic accommodation, and that's all it is. It's basic accommodation if people are living in hotels and whatever, which are not suitable long term for families. To then remove that is a little bit cheap when it comes to what our requirements are under international law. And also, when you think about it as well, one of the reasons why we took these people in is because of our military neutrality. We do not want to contribute to actually supplying guns and weapons to the Ukrainians to fight the Russians. So when you get off the hook with making your financial contributions in that way, there are other things that you have to do.
You're in for a shock, Matt.
I'm not in for any shock, Ivan.
When the ballot boxes are opened, in the same way that the woke agenda was completely out of sync with ordinary people, you're going to find that rural people, working class people are going to send a message to the politicians that they're going to elect people who want less migrants in this country, want less resources than 2 billion put to them, and they're quite unsympathetic. This is actually a dividing line for me about middle class politics versus other politics. And people feel there's an unfair distribution, but they laterally feel with Tent City they were just engulfed. And tolerance of this issue has just gone off the Richter scale.
You're fined €20 for the use of the work word, which I told you at the start of the series. Every time you threw that accusation at me, there would be a €20 fine, which will be put to a bet at the end of the series for charity. I won't be surprised at all by what is likely to happen in the polls. I think there is a danger, or when we get to the real polls rather than the opinion polls, I think there's a danger that we're underestimating the goodwill of many Irish people. So we'll see how that actually pans out. But I am interested in how it's going to play out in particular for Sinn Féin, because you may have seen some of the videos that are doing the rounds now of people pulling down posters and abusing those who are putting them up. There was one bizarre one that I saw this week which attacked a Sinn Féin candidate's canvasser who, rather baffled, started explaining to the person, we're not in power, we're not the government. And yet there seems to be a movement amongst a small number who are treating Sinn Féin as being the same as Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And you would have seen, for example, that there has been a graffiti put up near Mary Lou MacDonald's constituency clinic in Cabra, accusing her of being a traitor. And I suspect that for a lot of Sinn Féin people, that's a really damning slur to be thrown against them, that when they regard themselves as the nationalists and the patriots, to be accused of being a traitor to the patriotic cause. So we'll see how it all impacts as well on Sinn Féin's ever-shifting position in relation to immigration. Over the last decade, Sinn Féin has been exceptionally strong in its support for immigrants and has also wanted to put additional provisions into the hate speech legislation to protect immigrants. These are things that it's trying to roll back from now to try and protect what appears to be an eroding support. But that's a very difficult, tricky game to play, because I think a lot of people sort of see them as flip-flopping in relation to this, but I suspect that they may double down on the anti-open border stance, no matter how illogical that is, given their desire for no border in this island, because they feel that on balance of probabilities, that's what they need to do to shore up their vote for the European and local elections. Yeah,
the Sinn Féin thing is certainly very interesting, because it seems there might be a further slide in their level of support than we'd previously observed, from 30-something to the mid-20s. Two things I'd say. One is, when you become the largest party, everyone has a target on your back, whether it's far right, whether it's the government or whatever. You actually are a magnet, a lightning rod conductor for everyone to have a go at you. I did have an ironic smile, because I've always said about Sinn Féin, socialism, sustainability, they'll shelve that. The one thing they care about is a unitary state, a border poll and so on. And when I saw they were prepared to move from a position, we don't recognise the border, we just don't recognise it, we're an all-island thing. But actually, now that the immigration thing is getting so serious, we do want to recognise the border. I thought there was no limits to their pragmatism on that. But there's no doubt that the tone of politics and debating for the last couple of years has become really, really toxic. It's led online, and it's not that I disagree with you, it's that I want you dead. And this kind of, it does nothing for politics, it does nothing for debate, does nothing for democracy. And put it like this, I think we're just going to have to suck it up, because they're here to stay.
What would you fear, though, for the personal safety of many candidates and canvassers over the coming weeks? Because there's been more than a handful of issues already of physical and verbal intimidation, which surely has to be condemned, no matter who is on the receiving end of it. And it seems pretty widespread. There are people on the left and there are people in the middle. There might even be people on the right, politically, who have been targeted and victims of this.
Yeah, and I notice all this is done through a camera phone. And basically, I'm waiting for the day that the canvassers will switch on their phones, point it at their people who are shouting diatribes of abuse at them, and we'll actually report them.
OK, let's move on a little bit, because there's a big agenda of stuff that I want to get through on the programme today. I was amused to see last weekend Simon Harris deciding he wanted to emulate Micheál Martin by having a go at GAAGO, which is the streaming service that the GAA is using in partnership with RTE for the games that are not available free to air on RTE television. And of course, Micheál Martin made a big issue of this last year when there were various Cork games that were not on the television. And this year, the first 3 Cork games in the Munster Senior Hurling Championship have been on GAAGO rather than been on free to air. And as a result of that, many people missed out on an absolute epic, classic, wonderful Cork victory over the All-Ireland champions Limerick last Saturday evening. Before that game even happened, Simon Harris came out and had a go at the GAA in relation to this, and, asked it almost to examine its own conscience. And then he got burned. Jarlath Burns, the Armagh man who is the president of the GAA, is a wily operator, and he's a straight talker and a straight shooter. And he went on Claire Burns' radio show on Monday morning and he just cut the legs, I thought, out from underneath Simon Harris. What was Simon Harris playing at? Trying to pretend that he knew what the ordinary GAA person wanted and telling the GAA how they should be going about doing their business.
Well, Matt, you spent too much time in corporate boxes, prawn cocktail set in Croke Park. The reality is that the ordinary guy and girl on the street is horrified about GAAGO, and it's perfectly satisfactory, in my opinion, to have a politically populist position on this. First of all, the GAA shot themselves in the foot changing their calendar. The reason why there are difficulties with some of these matches, not on TG Car or on RT at all, is because the rugby season is still on. The Champions League final, Champions Cup, soccer, all that kind of thing. It should always be the case. There's people in Limerick who would support rugby teams during the winter, and during the summer they support the GAA teams. And when they moved to the early finish of the season as opposed to September, it was absolutely taking away their premium shop window, which made every youngster wanting to be an idol running out at corporate. So I think that's a much bigger issue. But look, €7 a match. If you don't, see, it's all right when you live in wealthy, leafy Rathgar, you can have broadband. But down the country, people don't have 3G, 1G, whatever broadband. People who are lining pitches with white and the backbone of it being excluded. No, all the politicians are right. GAA, it's the Grab All Association at it again.
Actually, there are so many things that are wrong with that now. First of all, can I tell you that rather than being in the corporate boxes, I would be in the premium level, but yes, but at least I go regularly to Croke Park, and I do talk to people, and you can get the season ticket for €79, for which you would have got 38 games for €79 if you'd bought the season ticket at the start of the season. The GAA has its own right. It has many revenue obligations. The GAA puts back 83% of the income that it gets in back to all the clubs and to the counties and the provincial levels. It's an expensive business running the GAA, which is one of the most important cultural institutions in the country. It is appropriate for it to actually decide to what it wants to do with its broadcasting rights. The bigger issue actually is RTE. Right, because RTE is in a commercial joint venture arrangement with GAAGO. As it's a commercial arrangement, RTE has to do what it can to make money out of that, especially given the situation that it finds itself in at present. We haven't been told how much the RTE has invested in GAAGO. We don't know whether it's actually losing money on it each year. But if you want to develop GAAGO as a service and a product that makes money for its shareholders, then you're going to have to put really good games on it, such as Cork and Limerick last weekend, such as many of the Gaelic football matches now in the initial rounds of the Sam Maguire Cup, given that the provincial championships are over, and also including 2 quarter-finals of the All-Ireland Senior Football Championship, which will all be available exclusively only on GAAGO. Which raises the question is RTE deliberately turning away from the free-to-air broadcast of games that people want to see because it wants to promote people's purchase of GAAGO? Is that not an enormous conflict of interest on RTE's part, that the public service broadcaster, which is in receipt of a licence fee to deliver as much as possible to its audience, is simultaneously charging that audience for access to this station or to these streaming service, but maybe pushing games off television to it?
Well, can I tell you that when I was living in Swansea, I used GAAGO because none of the pubs, there was no way you could watch the matches.
Sorry, there wasn't a GAAGO then. Sorry, when you were in Swansea, it would have been Sky that you would have watched, or there would have been other streams.
But how long is GAAGO on because the whole point about it was for immigrants who couldn't watch the matches. So my point being that now they've changed the agenda and used it as a money racket. In other words...
But sorry, you were paying for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nothing. You're the person who keeps telling me, Ivan, that you get nothing for nothing.
Yeah, but like at the end of the day, Virgin Media, any other broadcaster, Sky, have left the scene. I mean, like, there is no choice. And then for people who don't have broadband, and people also tell me that the quality production of some of the GAAGO matches isn't great.
But then take that up with RTE, who were brought in as a joint venture partner to actually do that. And maybe they don't have enough money to invest properly in relation to it. But I am also interested in you taking out the violin, suggesting that broadband isn't available beyond the towns and cities of Ireland. Hasn't that situation improved enormously? I know there are pockets around the country and people up in Boreens who might not get the full service or signal that they want. But in reality, haven't we gone past this idea that it's only in Dublin and in the other cities that you can get broadband or mobile phone coverage?
No, of course there has been some improvement, but I think there's still something like 20% of the public in more rural, remote areas that don't have coverage. But at the end of the day, the public sentiment on this is against putting these behind a paywall.
Okay, let's move on to other things. One of the things that I did earlier this week, it's been a busy week, Dublin Town invited me to host a forum with candidates in the local elections in front of many of their members who own businesses in Dublin city centre. And I was fascinated by the conversation. One of the things I was particularly interested in, Ivan, was the powerlessness of these sitting councillors who want to be re-elected, but we're essentially admitting that a lot of the time that what they're doing is talking about things they want to do and feel little or no power. Now, they have a certain degree of hope that the new city manager, Richard Shakespeare, will be much more proactive in doing things, in talking with them and with talking with business leaders. There was a hell of a lot of criticism of the former city manager, Owen Keegan, about how he had been, shall we say, he ploughed his own furrow and didn't really worry too much about what other people thought. That was one way of describing what he did. But there are so many issues around Dublin city centre which the councillors have identified, that various groups like the Joint Policing Authority have identified, and there was almost a sort of an eye-rolling at the political opportunism of Simon Harris announcing this 12-week review under the stewardship of somebody who we both know very well, David McRedmond, the chief executive of An Post, who I'd say is a friend of mine. But I just wonder about the necessity for this when we know all of the issues applying to Dublin city centre and actually need things done rather than talking about them again.
Well, I think that David McRedmond's task force is worthwhile to have some joined up thinking between Gardaí and local authorities and health services and so on. But can I just tangentially say that I know a friend now who's going to make a submission to David McRedmond. One of the big issues in inner city areas, across the city, even in Dún Laoghaire, is apparently all Georgian buildings and a lot of other buildings have actually got a preserved status. So the idea is, I met a group of developers who want to keep the facade but put in one-bedroom studio apartments, and they can't get planning permission for them because, most of this is 1963 exempt development for planning permission, but they can't get the fire cert because the Heritage Department of the Custom House say, oh, no, you couldn't possibly do this. So the only efficient way to make Dublin a living city, to provide accommodation for all these tech workers, because this would be private development, it's not social development, is actually to change the law. Because these people are operating in London, and they told me a very interesting story. They have 7 different grades of a preserved building. And so you'd have one that would be absolutely like the Custom House, you couldn't touch it inside or out. But you'd have lots of others where you keep the facade, you'd provide accommodation, you'd bring life back to these inner city areas across all Georgian Dublin. And actually, that, if they need to change the law on that as regards the administration of preserved buildings. But I'd like to come up with new thinking, because unless you make these, like in London, living, breathing areas, they will become ghettos.
For the first time on today's podcast, I think we might be in agreement, Ivan. And as it happens, I lived in Dublin city centre for my first 2 years in Dublin when I moved up from Cork in 1987. I lived in a flat over a shop in Dame Street. And I had 2 very happy years there in very cheap accommodation, but first year as student, second year my first job, it suited absolutely fine for what I needed. I know that the same flat, the building has now been converted into offices. All around the city centre, there are major issues, particularly with people now working from home on a more regular basis, people worried about if they come into the city centre, whether it's safe. but there is plenty of vacant units over shops all over the city centre which could actually house tens of thousands of people. And if you're working, for example, down the IFSC, and if you can't necessarily afford one of the expensive, shiny new apartments to rent down there, wouldn't it be great to have somewhere to rent over a building or over a shop on O'Connell Street? And the big issue in relation to regulations tends to be fire regulations. But last August, Aileen and myself and my youngest son were over in Paris for a few days. And a city that actually I have to shamefully admit I know little enough about, and I must go back again. But I was talking to people there about everyone living over the shop all around Paris. It is just what it's done. And I asked about the fire regulations, and they said, yeah, look, there are problems in that people give out that they don't have enough room to bring furniture up and down the stairs, and there's problems about fire exits. But as somebody I was talking to the other day said, sprinkler systems, if you put them into houses or into these buildings, modern sprinkler systems can actually deal with issues of fire. We're not talking about putting people into fire traps or death traps. We're talking about what's done in other cities around the world, and is done for the most part safely, and allows us not just to have accommodation instead of always trying to build new things further out from the core of the city centre, but putting people into the area to live in, and that'll revitalise areas and then make them a draw for people from the suburbs to come into. But there's so many issues. Another one, Ivan, that came up, and you might disagree with this, but the decision some decades ago to get rid of Dublin City Council doing bin collections, I think, has been a crazy one, because what you now have is you've about 3 or 4 private operators in competition with each other, clogging up the streets with their bin lorries coming in at different times of the day, rather than just having one centralised service. And it's not as if competition has made things cheaper. And one of the big issues that we have around Dublin city centre as well is that, my God, the amount of waste, it's filthy. The dirt around the place. And sorry, one other one that came up, which I was fascinated by, is unauthorised charitable work on the streets. So, for example, last year, I remember being quite taken aback one Friday evening to see the soup kitchen running outside the GPO, and the enormous queues of people who were actually at 7:30 in the evening queuing for soup and sandwiches. And that is terrible, that we have people who are reliant on charity for food. But at the same time, part of me wondered, is it appropriate that outside the GPO, the seat of the 1916 Rising, and I'm not talking about putting things out of sight, out of mind, but something that is a centrepiece for the state, an attraction for people to go to, that has been used as an unofficial soup kitchen by people who are not authorised to do so. And apparently, because of all the things that go on in the plaza outside the GPO now, it used to be they used to have to power hose it once every 2 months. They now have to do so once a week to actually try and keep it in a visual sense the way we would expect one of the landmarks of the state to be.
2 things on that. One is, if you go to somewhere like Merrion Square, a lot of those that are in offices at the moment will not meet the insulation BER standards going forward. So I'm saying they can all be converted to residences if we change the heritage and the fire cert regulations. And they've done this in London successfully, and they've brought back to life whole swathes of London City. And I think we need to do the same. And I think David McRedmond should focus on this. The other thing I'd say is that for my sins, I sometimes fill in for Pat Kenny, and I have to be in the studio at 7 a.m. They put me up in a Stay City hotel, not your plush things that you'd normally be staying in Cork and the likes of that. But the point about it is this, that I walked through the streets at 6:30 a.m.
It must be filthy.
Oh, stop. I felt so sorry for the workers there with power hoses and that. It is just desperate. Like, I've seen dungsteads in farming yards in better condition than some of this. So I absolutely agree. The cleansing thing has to be brought up to international standards.
You love following election races. You must have lots of gossip about what's going on in the MEP campaigns, do you? Yeah,
3 weeks today is voting day, so we're getting to the business end of this campaign. First of all, 3 polls out this week. There was Ireland Thinks with the Journal. There was a an Irish Times Behaviour and Attitude Ipsos poll. And Fionn Sheahan, intriguingly, got access to some private party polling, all of which is interesting. So the biggest factor in polls that you need to look at is, if you ask to say, who are you going to vote for, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin, blah, 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 or independent? 17% will say, I'll vote independent. But if you offer them a ballot paper for Midlands Northwest and you put Ciara Mullooly's name on it, it goes up to 24%. So what I'm trying to say to you is that we need to watch out for real elections, which is named candidates. So what's emerged to me is very interesting. Certainly, I would be upgrading Ciara Mullooly's chances. I think Fianna Fáil have made a serious mistake in running three candidates because there's only one viable candidate, that's Barry Cowan, and so therefore they're faced with the same choice as they had in 2019 and 2014. They ended up getting no seat because they didn't go for one seat. And you know, you could have a situation that Neil Blaney is eliminated and his transfers could go to Peter Casey instead of to Brian Cowan, simply following geography and Donegal and so on. So I think the message is going to go out to the Soldiers of Destiny to get behind Cowan, and he has not got a safe seat. The other person who I'm hearing is making great ground is Michael McNamara in the South constituency. Can't get a handle on, I think Niall Boylan will also be elected in Dublin. Can't get a handle on Claire Daly. I don't know whether her sell-by date is there or whether, you know, the old dog for the hard road, whether she'll make her way. But continuing trends, a third of the vote up to for independence, particularly independents that are not like you, anti-migration, and also the main parties under a bit of pressure. But Simon Harris is moving furiously to mend Fine Gael's hand on the migration issue, so it's still fairly fluid. But one of the questions, though, for these independents is what grouping they're going to sit in Europe, because, you know, the nature of the committee structure, 740 MEPs, lone wolves don't actually work. It's okay to have your Healy-Rays and some eccentric people on a county council or even a Dáil chamber, but at European level it actually doesn't work that way. You have to be part of a group to get amendments through and so on. So I actually think that there needs to be proper scrutiny of whether independents are actually the right thing to do. What have, you know, Ming, Flanagan, Claire Daly, Mick Wallace actually achieved over the last several years?
The key number I'm looking for is 25, and I'll tell you why it's 25. Again, based on the polls, which I'm not sure I'm going to take too much notice of, particularly after what you just said in relation to individual ballot papers when people see names rather than actually been told it's a party or independent, who would you vote for. The key figure being 25 is because I'm looking to see what Sinn Féin gets. And Sinn Féin got, 24.5% of the first preference vote in the last general election. And given all the opinion polls in the last couple of years, I mean, they would have been perhaps hoping to get into the 30s. They may still get into the 30s if they don't suffer at the hands of leakage to the independents because of their own attempts to modify their stance in relation to migration. It'll be interesting to see how it's all spun out, because I remember in the last local elections in 2019, Sinn Féin got less than 10% of the first preference vote. Lynn Boylan lost her seat in Dublin as an MEP. So whatever they get, I think they won something like 81 seats in the local election. So they're going to spin it that they have done better than they did in the last local elections, particularly when it comes to boasting about the number of seats they've added. But the key thing for them is, will they be able to get to the level of first preference votes that they achieved in the last general election? And although it mightn't say much for what happens in the next general election, in that people will vote differently in a general election to the way they do in a local or European election, and also that the turnout in a general election will be significantly bigger. But I think that's the key figure that we'll be looking at for Sinn Féin, with a view as to their chances of getting into government after the next general election, which, when all comes to all, is all that matters.
Just on Sinn Féin, I think they will do better in the general election than they will in the local election. I would, if you ask me to put a figure on Fianna Fáil in Sinn Féin in this election, I'd say 22%, whereas I think they can get 25% plus in a general election. Their whole candidate strategy is much more together. what I am hearing is Kathleen Funchion is going much better than Paul Gavin in the South, that she is actually likely to be elected from that Southeast bloc. And once she's ahead of him, she has the seat. I hear that McManus is well ahead of Gildernew, and there probably isn't a second seat there. And I'm also hearing beyond Lynn Boylan, Dahi Doolan is not polling well. And again, he's probably just there to fix himself up for a general election seat.
Well, he was on a panel, the Dublin Town event that I was doing this week, or at least he was supposed to be on a panel. He didn't show up. He had said he would be there, and then in the end he didn't turn up, and I don't think they got an explanation as to why he failed to show up. But there you go.
Was there a Fianna Fáil person on that panel?
There was.
Was there? Because on the list you sent me, there was no one named.
No, sorry, I'll tell you what it was. There was an introduction by Dáithí Rushta, the Fianna Fáil mayor. He did a sort of a 5-minute introduction to it, so there was an involvement there indeed. Actually, talking to Sinn Féin, what do you make of Michelle O'Neill? The COVID inquiry in the North this week, where she made an absolutely full apology for the attendance at the Bobby Story funeral back during the COVID lockdown. It struck me for a couple of reasons as been very significant. One is that she herself had said previously she would never apologise for going to the funeral of a friend. And the other thing is that a lot of the Sinn Féin leadership from the South travelled north and grouped together Mary Lou MacDonald, Pierce Doherty, former TD Martin Ferris, who had gone up from Kerry to meet the old IRA man, or the family and friends of the old IRA man Bobby Story, for his funeral. I remember that causing outrage at the time for the breach of the COVID regulations. I actually thought what was more dispiriting was the sort of the hero worshipping of Bobby Story, given his past track record. But I suppose don't speak ill of the dead, isn't that what they say? What did you make of her then deciding to sort of effectively do a volte-face on their position as to how they behaved at that funeral?
Well, I thought it was a car crash situation for her, because what happened was she seemed to have airbrushed out of her thing her texts of the 21st of March, the day after, which Arlene Foster kept and made available.
Just to clarify. This is the day after lockdown effectively was imposed. We're not talking about the Bobby Story funeral here.
Yeah.
We're talking about going back to earlier, which was also part of the COVID inquiry.
See, what the Inquisition person on behalf of the Claire Dobbin, KC, she was leading the inquiry. And so she said, OK, so what's your attitude to this? So she did a complete mea culpa apology and all the rest of it. And she didn't say, but actually I've done a major U-turn in this, because she then produced her witness statement to the tribunal of July last, and her texts, which she thought, because she deleted all her own texts, but they were kept elsewhere. And she actually went through it chapter and verse, and she kind of nailed her to the floor to say, when did you have this Pauline conversion? What she should have done was said, I was of this view and now I'm of that view. And she made a complete mess of it in relation to texts, in relation to school closures and so on. She tied herself up in knots. She obviously hadn't prepared properly.
Yeah, but that's not what anyone has been talking about since. That's when you get into the weeds, and I think Sam McBride did a very detailed analysis of all that in the Belfast Telegraph, which I suspect the vast majority of people will have no knowledge or interest in. What they're interested in is the soundbite story about her making the apology for going to the Bobby Story funeral.
Yeah, but put it like this. Given Partygate with Boris, given Golfgate here, an apology was in order.
And give her credit for that.
Yeah. But no, but where she got caught out was that she didn't acknowledge that the level of the U-turn she'd done, because here were all these texts saying she wasn't a bit sorry, that this was well marshalled, and all sorts of defences put forward. But you see, the point is, when you shift ground in politics or in a stated position, you've got to explain it. You can't have contradictory statements. And my take of this was, and Stephen Nolan did a whole programme on it on the BBC, and she came out of it as a bit of a luderon.
What's that?
An idiot.
Oh, no. I think she's actually, in some respects, one of the most impressive politicians, in that she does actually have an empathetic streak to her which comes across. And I think she's been very respectful to other traditions in the North, the way she has reached out to the DUP to make sure that the new ministry works with herself and Emma Little Pellingley, and also that you have her what she did in relation to the Queen's death and the coronation of King Charles, that she's shown an extraordinary maturity and a real sense of responsibility. I think she's actually been an impressive statesman-like person.
No, sorry, I actually totally agree with that, and I saw a poll that she was actually the most popular politician in the Republic, 55% rating, did a Late Show thing. She went to Windsor Park, and obviously when you look at these texts between Arlene Foster and her then as Deputy Minister and look at the relationship now, definitely I think Michelle is one of the most popular and successful politicians for Sinn Féin on the island and has moved the party forward. But I'm just saying this particular hearing and episode was a car crash.
You have another hobby horse you want to bring up. Conveyancing is one of your new ones.
Well, no, it's just there are 50,000 housing transactions a year. And one of the issues is, so a thing goes sale agreed. From sale agreed to actually concluding it can take 6 months. And I chaired an international conference, people who are auctioneers, surveyors and so on from Northern Ireland, the Republic, England, Wales and Scotland. And they are trying hard to get a uniform system which applies to public auctions, that you cannot put a property for public auction without having 11 different documents, title deeds, planning permission, I converted the attic and all these things which subsequently cause a legal problem. And the solicitors, you know what they do? They say, so the vendor is told by the auctioneer, you may go to your solicitor now before we ever do a deal on this. And they say, that'll be fine. And then they have the deposit of 10% in their hot little escrow account. And then you find that it takes 6 months. So what I'm saying is that for young couples and others, this is a huge issue. And it requires a change in the law that these sellers pack before, like you do for a public auction, for any private treaty sale, this must be done. You can't put a property for sale. And I think the sooner it's done, the better.
Absolutely agree with you. But you know something, Ivan? This is one of the big bugbears I would have. I've heard that argument been made countless times over the last decade. Loads of people bring it up. So why don't the politicians do anything to actually enforce it? Those who actually have power, to make sure that these anomalies are addressed.
Yeah, Mark Mashari produced a private member's bill on this. And you know what the government's response was? To set up a committee of experts in this area. It doesn't include many auctioneers. And it's called Probate and Conveyancing. And that'll kick it into touch for another 2 years, well into the lifetime. And you're absolutely right. It's these sort of practical issues. How effective is your property conveyancing system that, is bringing Ireland into disrepute?
Listen, I think we need to make a small clarification, don't we, on something you said recently on the programme about Garda recruitment.
Yeah. So we got, this was an episode of the podcast on the 27th of April. And we got a letter from a former Enniscorthy man, used to be in the public transport area, Andrew McAlinden, who's head of the Garda press office, to whom it may concern. I'm writing to request a correction to a factual inaccuracy on the Path to Power podcast of the 27th of April. In this, the presenters state that recruitment of Gardaí has been handled by a non-EU UK company and that the process has been a disaster. And then he says that the recruitment is still with the Public Appointments Commission, and secondly, that they had 6,300 applicants. So I'm happy to clarify the following. I should have said that it's just for the civilian recruitment as opposed to the armed Garda force that the company staff line have won a tender from An Garda Síochána to take over this. It's reputed to be 4 million. Their head office is in Ballymena in Northern Ireland, but the Public Appointments Service still does the mainline Garda thing. But my central point was that if you compare 2020 to 2023, total Garda numbers have gone from 14,491 to 13,930, and that over the same 4-year period, those who left An Garda Síochána retirements was 1,738, whereas those recruited was a lesser figure of 1,400. But I'm happy to make the correction that the staffing recruitment related to the civilian core of the Gardaí.
That's fine. What actually struck me, though, listening to all of that, though, was that I wouldn't exactly be boasting about 6,300 applications been made. what's actually is required is the numbers that actually end up joining the force. And as you've pointed out, the numbers are in decline. And in fact, one of the other issues that they have is that people actually sign up to go to Templemore and they don't even turn up for training, or they drop out of training. And there is a major issue still about getting enough Gardaí on board. Okay, I think we're coming towards the end. Is there anything else you want to bring up, Ivan? Any other business?
You had your knickers in a knot about selling tobacco to a 20-year-old or 21 years of age.
No.
Vaping is the thing now, isn't it? You know?
Oh, absolutely. I believe me, I never get my underwear in any sort of knot, Ivan. But anyway, no, I think it's interesting again, this idea, you can drive at the age of 17, you can vote at the age of 18, you can drink pints at the age of 18, and suddenly you've been told you can't make up a rational decision until you're 21 as to whether you want to buy tobacco or not. I hate smoking. As an asthmatic, I insist that nobody in the house smokes in the house or whatever. I would be concerned about vaping. I see younger generations taking to it and not quite sure as to what dangers may be inherent in it. But I would rather actually fight the vaping and the smoking of the under 18s rather than actually trying to infantilise 18 to 21-year-olds by deciding we know better as to what you should be doing. If you're an adult, you can make your own mistakes.
You asked me, was there anything else on my mind? A little birdie told me that you were pontificating in Goffs yesterday to 900 people on The Real Deal, which is a venture capital organisation called Renatus, has been running it for a number of years, and you were chairing it. The point I wanted to make was I'm an investor in Renatus for my sins, but they produced this weekly newsletter, and the thought for the week that they had, it comes out every Sunday, which did catch my eye. Finance Minister Michael McGrath highlighted that the windfall element of the 24.5 billion in corporation tax is as high as 11 billion. And when you take that out, and if that windfall is a windfall and disappears, our surplus of 8.6 billion looks quite paltry and in jeopardy. And it's the first time I've actually seen, the windfall figure actually itemised, and I thought it was very interesting.
Well, you say I'm pontificating. I think you actually engage in projection, Ivan, that you project onto others your own behaviour. When I chair these conferences, I merely ask questions without ever offering any opinions. And what was very interesting yesterday was Niall Malloy was of Echelon. The data centre provider was there. Echelon recently signed a deal. It's a company that was only set up in 2017. It has a major data centre in Arklow on the site of the old IFI, which they took over the site when it became redundant. It also has premises on the outskirts of Dublin. And for example, it hosts the data centre for TikTok. It's a business that he has scaled up dramatically since he opened it in 2017. Recently, Starwood Capital invested €850 million in the business, putting a value of $2.5 billion on it. And what Niall Malloy and his colleagues have been given the task by Starwood to do is to build many more data centres across Europe. He was in America last week, and he told the audience at The Real Deal yesterday that there is no serious concern in the United States as to where we stand in relation to data centres facilitating multinational investment. Now, you can have many environmental concerns in relation to data centres, and rightly so, because they do use a phenomenal amount of energy, and they're going to use an enormous amount of additional energy as we go further into the world of generative artificial intelligence. And this is a major issue. However, the data centres have been doing more work than anybody else in relation to ensuring that they get energy power sources that are non-fossil fuel. So they're the ones who are actually spending the money and developing the wind farms and the solar energy and the biomass to make sure that that powers their data centres. So they're not actually taking power away from anybody else. Now, you could argue that, well, why can't we use the wind farms and the rest of their energy for the national grid for everybody else's use? And, as long as somebody's prepared to pay for all the construction of the capacity, yeah, very good. But the point is, back to what you just said, if we're not sure about the continuation of the corporation tax revenues that we need to fund our health services, our education, everything else that we need tax revenues for, social welfare, payment for the immigrants coming into the country, then we need to actually support the development of infrastructure such as data centres and do it in an environmentally friendly way. But we need them. And if we're perceived as suddenly slowing up on this and not having the grid in place to facilitate it, then the golden goose in relation to foreign multinational investment could dry up very quickly.
Yeah, and in the same way that the solution to the housing crisis is increased supply, the solution to the data centre problem is increased electricity power generation. And from renewable sources, solar and wind, onshore and offshore, is not being provided because of our planning system, and the sooner the government wake up to this. But I can't criticise you too much for your opulent gigs, because on Sunday I'm off to Killarney for it's an inaugural event. It's the Global Economic Summit. It's an Irish attempt at Davos. I'm going to have the New York State Governor. I'm going to have Prince Albert. I'm from Monaco, and all sorts of elite C-level people from Accenture, Google, and so on. This type of people that you normally mix with on an average Monday. It's a 3-day event in the Europe Hotel, and I'm greatly looking forward to learning about generative AI and the best in class in terms of global sustainability. And the briefing I'm doing, there are 4 tier races for sustainability. There's Europe, the US, Asia, and the rest of the world. And I'll be able to report next week who's best in class of those, with Trump and so on. So really, someone from the Biden administration started Social Security. It's an A-lister crew, and I'm going to learn a lot.
Well, indeed, but get out and about in Killarney, which is a town that I know well and is host at the moment to lots of immigrants.
Yeah, 4,500 Ukrainians and 700 international provision.
Do what I've done, go and have chats with them. Anyway, I look forward to talking to you next week on Path to Power, episode 22 next week. If you want to get in touch, don't forget to do so by getting emails to mail@pathtopowerpodcast.com. So from me in Cork, Matt Cooper.
And from Ivan Yates here in Dublin.
Thank you very much for being with us. Talk to you next week.